Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, Bakery had my mum's car towed, so I got the business closed down. This happened about 8 years ago, 2013, and when I tell people the story, I get mixed reactions, so I figure why not tell Reddit. My mum and I decided to go out to lunch one day. We drove until we found a lot that's business did not appear to be open at the time. My mum pulls into the lot and parks in a spot. We both walk over and investigate the business's window. It was a pastry shop for purposes later in the story. The lights are not on, the door is locked and there is a sign that says closed right behind the door. We conclude they are closed and went to eat our lunch. We finish eating about a little over an hour later and come back to find out our car was missing, but now the bakery was open. My mum and I walk inside of the bakery and ask if they had seen our car. The owner, with a very stern tone and attitude, said, "Yeah, I had it towed because it was taking up spots for potential customers. You should have come inside to ask me first." My mum responds that we did attempt to see if she was open and even buy something to see if we could park there for an hour or so. She calls us liars and said she had been open all day and we never attempted to ask. My mum just basically said we tried and that it was wrong for her to tow us with so many other spots still available. The owner said something back to my mum that really upset her and made her cry. All while this was going on, I was taking mental notes that this pastry shop was having insulation work being done. The insulation worker, who I can only assume was a random contractor and not a specialist, was doing the work right over the prep table for the food, all while smoking a cigarette. As I go to console my mum, I turn around and tell the lady her sign still says closed like when we originally came to the door. She storms up to me, picks up the sign and slams in around to open. "We are open now." I calmed my mum down and we eventually got the car back from the tow company and got home. Once we got home, I was angry that lady made my mum cry, so I wanted revenge. I called the health department for the city. I say exactly what I wrote above to the guy on the phone, who puts me on hold and tells me to repeat everything I said word for word to his director. I tell the director the story, nothing about the car being towed obviously. I was a concerned citizen. She verifies the address, location with me 3 separate times. Yes, the name was X, yes it was across the street from this restaurant on this street. She then tells me that she shut down that business the week prior for plumbing issues, insulation, and multiple other infractions. She was told she could not be open and operate a business until the plumbing issue was fixed and approved, told me she would handle it. Later that night on the news that business was being shut down for good for all the infractions, and I could see my mum look so confused and happy at the same time, like karma worked for her that quickly. Told my mum years later and she loved it. Next one is titled, One-Party Consent Recordings, the Kryptonite of a Whole Supervisors. I'm a paramedic and after many years of working regular ground ambulance, I decided I had enough. My whole career I was either a glorified Uber driver, being spit on by drunks, bit by meth heads, or chauffeuring people between hospitals, though once in a blue moon I saved a life. There isn't a lot of different jobs you can parlay an M's career into. So I elected to move into the private sector and got a job doing basically the same thing at a mine but in a remote environment. I worked 2 weeks straight with 2 weeks off and less stress and an enviable salary. On the surface this was a sweet gig, almost heaven compared to the regular stretcher jockey job I came from, and it would have been such if not for the absolute psychopath who managed the M's services out there. I didn't work directly from the mine's operator, instead I was employed by a contractor. The coordinator, my local boss, as he was called, was a golden boy as far as the mine co. was concerned. There wasn't a butt he didn't kiss or bigwig he wouldn't suck up to. And I admit he could be charming, quite adept at impersonating a human being actually. It wasn't long before I discovered he reserved decency for everyone but his subordinates. His behavior started out as petty micromanaging, which was irritating, but then progressed to insults, put-downs, name-calling, "Hey dumbass" was his usual way to get my attention, and outright hostility. The man clearly enjoyed being a petty workplace despot and knew he could get away with it because of his reputation with our paymasters. It was around the 2-month mark before I really warmed up to my coworkers. There were 8 of us, including myself and the a-hole in chief, and not single one of them spoke a nice word about him. Most were resigned to him acting like a massive a-hole because the 2-week holiday every month along with the pay rate. They also told me every complaint only fell on deaf ears, provoked retaliation, and again his relationship with the client made him nigh untouchable. This is when I started recording everything and did so with these 2 assumptions. 1. The company would only act with serious proof of malfeasance. 2. His acts of bastardry would only escalate. Neither assumption proved false. I had nearly 3 months of audio tapes of him being just his regular a-hole self before he went too far. About a week into the shift I showed up to our station and was called into his office only to be informed I was being let go and my replacement would be there in a few hours. I was to go back to our accommodations, pack my crap up and report back there. Well, duck, I thought before doing as I was bidden. Upon arriving back to the office with my suitcases, this sadist started laughing and said, "No one's coming to replace you. You're so ducking gullible." It was a mock firing and I'm sure he jacked himself off to it later that night. I was livid and let loose on him, finally ending a tirade with a malicious hint. Can you imagine what the office would do if they could have heard all this BS? Unrepentant to the last, he coldly stared at me before replying, "Can you imagine what they would do if a bunch of empty beer cans turned up and I told the office I saw you drinking?" Having recorded all this and knowing my glorious victory was assured, I feigned capitulation to carry on with my day. My first day off I sent in a detailed letter to the company along with recordings, and as expected they fired his butt. What came after was righteous cackling laughter, for hours. I wonder, is this how Napoleon felt after winning at Austerlitz? Next one is titled, "Tables of Karma Turned, as I willfully, gladly wrecked her life by denying her tenure." Welcome to Japan. This happened in Japan, so a lot won't make sense unless you have experienced living here, thus, I had to provide a lot of details to enlighten you, my readers. Please bear this in mind. I worked as an assistant language teacher, foreign English teacher, at a public Japanese junior high school in the early 2000s. This was a yearly contract, limited to 5 years, and the first year was a probation period. When hired, the hiring official at the Board of Education told me this was a formality, do a good job, be friendly to the kids, and my contract would easily be extended. Basically everyone was rehired. This job involved accompanying 6 Japanese English teachers to their classes, modeling correct English pronunciation, and working as their assistant teacher. Among the 6 teachers, one was a department head, and she set my schedule, deciding which periods I worked and the teachers I assisted. In the beginning, I didn't know anything structure-wise about the Japanese school system, the teachers' backgrounds, etc. I just knew that I was the lowest guy on the totem pole, and I worked for these teachers. After some time, one of the Japanese English teachers casually mentioned to me that she had tenure. I had assumed that all of the teachers had tenure, but several of the Japanese English teachers were also on yearly contracts, including the department head who was filling in for a tenured teacher, the original department head, on maternity leave. I thought this was a little strange, but in my eyes, I didn't see that this teacher did anything extra other than making my weekly schedule. I knew she was around my age and had been a teacher for a few years, remember that. There was a lot of strangeness I discovered while working, such as many of the teachers, tenured and non, only had associate degrees, to include this acting department head. So this was Japan, and they did things differently, strange but whatever. I will admit I was very naive. Some important details to know at this point: my position, no tenure possible, work 5 years, move on. The Japanese yearly contract teachers also had 5-year limits, but if they passed the national teachers exam, they would earn tenure. They had to pass this exam within 5 attempts, 5 years, also important detail. Again, I didn't know these latter details at the time. I had been working there for about 6 months, and one day I am walking to class with the acting department head. She mentions to me that she heard how much the assistant language teachers make. There were 10 of us scattered at various schools in the city. I prefer not to talk about such matters, so I nodded and listened. That is a lot of money for only 6 hours a day, my contract. It ended there. Note, all of the Japanese teachers, tenured or not, typically worked 10-hour days, often more. At this point, it is March. The school year has ended, and the new school year starts in April. The Board of Ed calls to notify me that I need to come in and discuss my contract for the next school year. I went to this meeting with confidence. Arriving in the office, I am met by 3 to 4 stern-looking officials, and they inform me that my evaluation submitted by the school was unsatisfactory, and the school recommended that I not be rehired by the board. Stunned is an understatement. More details emerged, comments from the evaluation, such as bad attitude, unfriendly, not a team player, none of it justified. I asked who submitted the evaluation, and they told me the department head, but the input was from all of the English teachers. My explanations to these accusations were going nowhere, so finally I pleaded for them to call the school and individually ask the remaining teachers of their evaluations. I sincerely believed I had good relations with all of the teachers. Rather than firing me on the spot, which they were planning, they agreed, and only mentioned they would get back to me. A few days passed, and I was cleared by the Board of Ed for another year. They simply said that there was a misunderstanding, and they apologized. Arriving back at the school in April, a few English teachers who had worked there the previous school year explained that they had submitted all positive notes to the department head, but the department head obviously did not submit those. This teacher had also moved on to another school, as the teacher on maternity leave, the original department head, had returned, so I had no chance to directly confront her. A few years passed without incident. I changed schools, and I now worked in the prefecture capital. I was asked by the prefectural board if I would like to proctor the national teachers' exams on a Saturday for extra cash. I agreed. The other foreign teachers and I had to sit as the primary interviewers for the interview portion of the exam and grade their exam essays. The interviewing team consisted of 3 people, myself and 2 school principals, who didn't speak English. I had a list of about 50 questions. About half were extremely easy, such as, why do you want to be a teacher, and some that were quite difficult, how do you cultivate positive relationships with your students and create a sense of class community? I honestly don't remember the exact questions, only that about 1/2 were easy, 1/2 were difficult, even difficult if you were interviewing in your native tongue. I ran the entire interviews for all applicants that day. The principals just sat and marked scores. I tended to shy away from the difficult questions because I had at this point worked for nearly 3 years and knew the English level of most teachers. It usually was pretty basic. When the applicants had left the room, the principals asked for my ratings for the questions I asked. The scoring was a simple 1 to 10 rating. If I said 10, they circled 10, 1 they circled 1, and so forth. They officially recorded the scores, but solely relied on my judgment, no questions asked. There were about 20 applicants I had to interview that day. The interviews were quick, and I didn't take note of the names until the applicants walked in. As I am looking down reading the next applicant's name, I pause, and then the door closes. As I look up, I see the applicant's face turn from confidence to dread. The tables had turned. My former department head boss sits, and I got to it, choosing only the difficult questions that had no business being on that exam. She didn't have a chance. The interview concludes, she leaves, and the principals ask for my rating. 1, 1, 1, etc. down the line, and they circled. After the interviews, I also had the great pleasure of grading all of the essays of the same applicants I had interviewed. Have you ever heard that essay grading is subjective? Well, I will let that question hang. She definitely didn't pass the Nationals teacher exam that year, and I do believe that the year I graded her interview and essay was likely year 5, her last attempt. Next one is titled, A Group of Karens Get Shut Up at a Funeral. A few weeks ago, my aunt passed away. She had a problem with prescription medication and eventually it got the best of her. My uncle has his own business as a gardener, which pays the bills but doesn't allow for much excess spending. Due to this, we had to crowdfund for a memorial service. Knowing it was more what she wanted, we opted to have a memorial gathering at a local bar outside event, COVID and all, where the people she loved could gather and have natural fun. Everything was great, until it got time for the eulogies. While everyone in the immediate family was up at the front, my girlfriend and I were sitting at a table a bit toward the back. Unfortunately, a group of Karens happened to be sitting at the table behind us. As the members of my family started to give their speeches, we could hear the Karens talking about the service, and, of course, how they didn't like it. Conversations like "this venue is so terrible, funerals belong in a church," and "maybe they would have afforded a good venue if she wasn't such a pill popper," occurred frequently. Obviously I didn't like the things they were saying about my aunt. We were very close, but considering it was a service and I am a relaxed person by nature, I didn't want to say anything. My girlfriend, however, is not nearly as subtle as I am. But she respects that I don't want to make a scene, so she leaves it be. Then it's my turn to go up and give my speech. I introduce myself as her nephew, who my aunt loved as her own child. The look on the Karens' faces were of shock. I give my speech and hug my uncle, then return to my seat. The silence from the Karens' table was deafening. Later, my girlfriend told me that when I introduced myself and started my speech, the Karens said, "Oh my God, that young man was one of her nephews, I hope he didn't hear anything," to which my girlfriend turned around in her chair and said, "Oh, he heard everything all right." They left the service shortly after. Good riddance. Edit. To answer a question I see frequently in the comments, the Karens were there because they were my aunt's friends. I've never seen them before, but my aunt was a very social person, so there were many people I didn't know. You ask me, the friends that do that kind of thing aren't really friends at all. Lastly, I wanted to give an honest thank you to everyone who has shared kind words and condolences. I've been reading many of the comments and stories others have been sharing. It's been really tough, and seeing this kindness has helped a lot, so thank you. Next one is titled, "Break into my car? Have fun digging through trash before getting arrested." This just happened, and most of the credit goes to my mum, who noticed the camera going off, and was quick to call the cops. I still live at home due to the pandemic, so my relationship is long distance until we can both afford to move in together. So I, 22 female, had just been chatting with my girlfriend over Discord and was about to go to bed when my mum came upstairs and told me someone had gotten into my car. For some reason it didn't lock, but my car is also 14 years old, so who knows. Anyways, on the video this guy walks up our driveway, opens my car door, rummages through my glove box and on the floor. Which, to be fair, I had an empty envelope in there, but he stuck his hand in empty soda bottles to figure that out, then he left my car without closing the door. How rude is that? Empty-handed, and was caught 2 streets down not even an hour later. Best part is we have the only camera that had recorded it, and out of all the others that were broken into, I was the only one that didn't lose anything. And we have clear footage of him, so he got positively incriminated and got nothing out of it. Glad my parents are great and had those cameras installed. Have fun in jail, jerkwad. Also, he had someone else with him and they broke into 5 other cars and did manage to steal some stuff, but I don't keep valuables in my car for this reason exactly. Next one is titled, "Handicap Parking Revenge." I was driving my dad's car and he has handicap plates. At about 5:30 I went to a store that is right next to a chain martial arts studio. It was during a kid class time and there were 30 kids doing their thing in the parking lot. Other than the few empty spots reserved for the class, the lot was very full, including the 2 handicap spots. The people parked in said spots did not have qualifying plates. Now, I don't abuse the plates and do not use handicap parking while my dad is not with me, but I had no problem blocking in the 2 people parked illegally. I run in the store, my items were waiting for me at the counter. Inside for maybe 2 minutes. Sure enough, one person was at my car waiting for me to return, so they could yell at me for inconveniencing them. When they did, all I said was, "Are you parked in a handicap spot?" and pointed at my plates. They quietly got back in their car. I took my time rearranging a few things before I drove off smiling. Next one is titled, "Trim My Tree, I'll Take Your Shade." Last summer, our neighbors behind us trimmed some branches from our willow tree. Now, the branches went over the property line, so it was well within their right to trim them, but a couple things really got to me. First of all, it was the middle of the summer, which is not a good time to be cutting on plants. Secondly, they mangled the tree. I don't know what they used to cut the branches, but it was horrifying. And lastly, they took all the trimmed branches and threw them back over the fence onto our property to deal with. If they had just knocked on our door and discussed it with us, I would have been more than happy to help them out. Like I said, the branches were over the property line. So, a couple days ago, when I was doing my annual spring branch trimming, I decided to get a little bit of revenge. I climbed up on a ladder and cut down over half of the branches hanging out over the property line. I made sure none of the branches fell over the fence so they didn't have any cleanup. But now this summer, when it reaches over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they will have hardly any shade from our tree. And since they never bother to plant any of their own trees, they will have no respite from the sun. Last one is titled, "The Finale Was Even Better." When I was a kid, my family lived in a house on a street with giant oak trees. Because of the slope of our property, leaves from half the street would end up in our yard. My mother had really bad asthma and allergies and made us kids rake up the leaves. This was not an easy task. They would get several feet deep if we didn't do it often enough. One day, we raked the whole yard into these giant piles for the city to come to pick up. It took several hours. The next morning, they were scattered all over. We raked them again over several more hours and it happened again. Apparently, the neighborhood bully was knocking them over just to be a jerk. The next time we made a super huge pile around the fire hydrant hoping he'd kick him and hurt his foot. Nope, this time he decided to do a run and jump. I watched it peeking through the blinds. He ended up breaking several bones. I didn't even feel bad. Thanks for listening.